Caught in retrospective grandeur, war tends to lack some inherent intangible. We see the whole affair as the fulfillment of an already known outcome. True, we acknowledge, men have died, and also, we realize, perhaps they should not have. But, we rationalize, the world is the way it is for sometimes arbitrary reasons. What is done, what has happened, happened. Wherein then lies war's soul? What transcendence carries the validity of prior conflict ever onward? There are many history books, but what can they do except relate actions and anecdotes of the victor? War is born, war exists, and war dies with the individual. The horrific legacy of World War II was as devastatingly personal locally as it was devastatingly impersonal globally. Nowhere is this more apparent than in the fall of Bataan, the Allied stronghold of the Philippines, to Japanese invaders.
Bataan has fallen, but the spirit that made it stand, a beacon to all the liberty-loving people of the world, cannot fall. We have been denied by weaklings, lashed with repeated oppression, tortured and starved. We have been given gall to drink, and we have shed our blood. To those who look upon us from afar, it must seem the Filipino people have descended into hell. But we shall rise. We shall rise in the name of freedom, and the East shall be alight with the glory of our liberation.
Tabaco, a small Philippine city in the south of Luzon, was a quintessential Filipino community, home of the Chavezes, an affluent family who bore, in ancestry, language, and name, remnants of Spanish occupation, Spain having presided in the Philippines from the age of exploration until the Spanish-American War and annexation as a United States territory. With the 1930s, though, the Philippines were enjoying relative freedom and some degree of prosperity. Blatant ties to America were apparent, yet had allowed the Philippines to bloom into a substantial factor in American trade. The Filipinos were, after all, to quote Theodore Roosevelt, our little brown brothers. But the majority of Filipinos, unlike the Chavez family, were farmers. This agrarian emphasis propagated a tenant-farmer system, while also serving to concentrate wealth into few and mostly foreign hands. Systematic Japanese immigration was a harbinger of military action to come. As Japan rapidly expanded through the Pacific, American military force in the Philippines began to build in anticipation. The culmination was reached on December 7, 1941, just hours after the Pacific Fleet was crippled at Pearl Harbor, as the Japanese initiated months of bombings and assaults. The American presence was decimated, and the Filipinos strove for survival. The Chavezes, parents dead, fled to the wilderness of Mount Mayon, a local volcano, while Edward Chavez, the eldest son, fulfilled his patriotic duty and enlisted as a Philippine scout shortly before his 18th birthday. Humanity, it seems, reigns supreme. The Japanese occupation of the Philippines was not the brutal show of violence that an impersonal overview may relegate it as. Masaharu Homma, the poet general, commander of the Japanese 14th Army tasked with the Philippine invasion, foresaw the disastrous implications of war and urged his troops to individually respect the Filipinos as friends. The insubordination and hostility bred by his actions only served to elucidate a darker side of human nature. Yet even on a small scale, the Japanese displayed poignant shows of humanity.
And then every once in a while, the private soldiers would come up and talk to us girls, and sort of in broken English, explain to us how he got into the Japanese Navy, and that he missed his family so, just like everybody else during war, they are taken away from their families.
For Edward Chavez and the Philippine-American Army, however, examples of individual decency mattered little. The ill-equipped military defenses were quickly falling, and General Douglas MacArthur, head of the Phil-American Army, whose legacy would include fame as commander of the Pacific Theater, drew his troops back to the Bataan Peninsula, leaving the capital of Manila open to occupation. Evacuated by President Roosevelt to Australia, General MacArthur's departure was the beginning of the end. The Philippines were left, almost helpless, under the control of Lieutenant General Jonathan Wainwright and the Bataan Peninsula under Major General Edward King. A sole solace was provided in the radio broadcast by the Army Command deep in the tunnels of the harbor fortress of Corregidor, reiterating to the people the fact that Bataan still stood. And while Bataan stood, the bitter fighting continued. For 3 months it had held, and for 1 more it would hold, futilely anticipating promised American reinforcement as the bloody Battle of Bataan raged on. But despite McCarthy's insistence from Australia that, "I have come through, and I shall return," Bataan was, bureaucratically assumed, by now a lost cause. On Easter Sunday, April 9, 1942, General King sadly surrendered the peninsula, against orders, to the ubiquitous Japanese presence. Bataan had fallen, and Corregidor, Wainwright's stronghold, would consequently follow, bringing with it the Philippines just 1 month later. Unfortunately for the living, it was not God who took them unto himself, but the Japanese. Driven by differing societal ideals, Japanese treatment of prisoners of war was infamous. The forthcoming Bataan Death March would propagate such appalling legacy. Individually, the treatment received by Edward Chavez and 75,000 fellow prisoners of war was a culmination of several general factors. Personal treatment notwithstanding, the Japanese had only prepared to take a force of 25,000. Therefore, a malnourished and diseased army thrice the anticipated size presented a logistical challenge in its transportation from the tip of Bataan to Camp O'Donnell, a prison camp 65 miles away. Supplemented by inefficient planning and the aforementioned cultural attitude, things did not look good for Chavez. Yet with a resounding Japanese promise that "we are not barbarians," Chavez, already wounded from the fighting, and his fellows were roused from their barracks. Divided hopelessly from their captors by language and custom, they were stripped of possessions and beaten into semi-order in preparation for the march to Camp O'Donnell, which commenced on April 10th. The following atrocities rank among the worst of the Second World War. Plagued already by malaria, beriberi, dysentery, hunger, dehydration, the prisoners were subject now to starvation, neglect, and intense punishment. Stragglers were beaten, those who rested were shot, death by execution became as common as death by disease. Corpses began to litter the path. But yet again, individual humanity, if superficial, proved transcendent. Hidden decency alone could not save Edward Chavez, fallen victim to dehydration and starvation compounded with malaria, nor 10,000 other Filipinos and 600 Americans. The soldiers marched seemingly ever onward, tormented by the deaths of their comrades, brothers, and friends, and the seemingly impending inevitability of death. Within a week, Camp O'Donnell was reached, yet the physical and psychological trauma of the individuals would remain indefinitely.
It was very, very tragic and close to me in particular, where I had been in the Philippines, and he had such an awful experience. And you can understand, well, you've seen the pictures of it. Just seeing the pictures can keep you awake, but having been part of it, it was a horror. Really was a horror.
Bataan's tangible, pragmatic effect on the course of World War II was undeniable. The courageous opposition provided by the Phil-American Army set back the Japanese timetable for Philippine victory by 76 days, from the expected January 22nd to April 9th. This allowed American fortification of Australia and reassurance of victory within the Pacific theater. None of this, though, was possible without the variable of the individual. While the effect on the overall war effort may have been tangible, the effect upon the people was not. Edward Chavez left behind 8 siblings in a country torn asunder by war. The emotional effects of the deaths of him and innumerable others are inestimable. The whole affair represents the tragic clash of the actions of individuals, the Japanese, dictated by their tragically strict code of honor, and the Americans and Filipinos, yet both parties fighting for their ideals. Edward Chavez lost his life for the sake of his family and his country, but he was just one of thousands. With his death, simultaneously did ineffable grief sweep all those connected to the fallen, and this reinforces that, in the end, war affects solely the individual. War does not care for strategy and consequence. War is, above all, a matter of life and death. Every other outcome is corollary in consequence. The loss of an army can be translated into figures and facts, into statements and estimates, the loss of an individual has an incalculable effect upon the world.